So we've been going through the book of Genesis, creation, fall, flood, Babel, and then we looked at the patriarchs. We looked at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the story in Genesis turns to Joseph, the story of Joseph in chapter 37. It's a really well-known story. Probably it's most well known for the way the story ends. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph says this magnificent line, and he says it to his brothers. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good," right? And so that's how the story ends. And again, we're going to talk about suffering today. But it's interesting that Joseph is able to say this in hindsight, right? After the suffering had passed and after there'd been a resolution to it all, Joseph is able to look back and he's able to say to his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." So that's chapter 50. The story of Joseph starts in chapter 37. And then there's a middle part to it, and the middle part is in chapter 41, verse 46. Chapter 41, verse 46, and we're told this is the middle of the story. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, right? And so there's Joseph's life before he entered the service of Pharaoh, and there's Joseph's life after he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Again, the middle part being that he's 30 years old when this happens. So it's interesting when you start reading the story starts by telling us that Joseph is 17, right? So the math is really simple. It was 13 years from the time the story starts to when he enters the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. That's 13 years of just hardship and difficulty and suffering. So that's 13 years of his life not going the way he wanted it to go. And I think it's interesting for you all because you're all probably in that Joseph age range. Joseph was 17 to 30, right? So whether if you're in your 20s, right, that's Joseph's life from 17 to 30. We're going to read a lot of the story. I think there's a real danger of being a Christian for a long time, and I think that there's a danger to knowing the stories of the Bible well. I think it's really good, but I think the danger is that you think that you know the story, and you just don't listen, you don't read as well. It's an amazing story. I want to encourage you as we read through it that you read and that you listen like you've never heard the story before. I think one of the dangers is when you think that you know a story of the Bible, you just don't listen to it very carefully and you don't listen to it well, and you don't realize how amazing the stories are. And so if we could just listen really well. I was going to start in the middle of chapter 37, but I've changed my mind this morning. We're going to read starting in Genesis 37, and let's start at verse 1, and we'll just read the story. Again, read it like you've never read it before, right? Try to read it and listen to it. I'll give you a hint. As you read it, it's a really normal family. In some ways, it's a really normal family. In some ways, it's a really extraordinary family, right? But, so here we go. Genesis 37, starting in verse 1. This is the word of God. So Jacob, remember, he was with his uncle Laban, married Leah and Rachel, came back. He met his brother Esau. Now he's back. And Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, Isaac, right, in the land of Canaan. So these are the generations of Jacob. So this is the story of Jacob, right? Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Now remember, Bilhah and Zilpah were his wives' female servants, right? So he was with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report to them, to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to them, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar. And before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, and Reuben's the oldest, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to rescue him, to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. The Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit, he saw that Joseph was not in the pit. He tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So we'll stop there for right now. We're going to continue reading on in Genesis 39, but just a couple of observations of what I see in Genesis 37. First, it's interesting that Jacob repeats the same mistakes as his father Isaac. It's kind of ironic. So remember Jacob, he longed for his father's affections, right? His father Isaac favored his brother Esau, right? Father wanted to give Esau the blessing. And so even Isaac, right, Jacob's father, played favorites, right? And so you would think that of all people, that Jacob would learn from his father's mistakes, especially because he wasn't the favorite of his father. And so you would think that he would know what it feels like to be the not favorite one, to be the not loved one. And you would just think that Jacob would learn from his father's mistakes and not do the same thing. But it's interesting, I think, that Jacob makes the same mistake as his father, and he favors Joseph, right? I don't get the whole colored robe. Like when I read this story, it's not like, oh, wow, that's incredible. But when I think of my family, I know, like, let's say I bought one of my boys like a really nice pair of shoes, right? If I bought like one of them a really nice pair of shoes, but then the rest didn't get a nice pair of shoes, I think something similar would happen, right? I think there would be some jealousy, right? I think there might be some hatred. And so you see that, there's a family with brothers, and there's some sibling rivalry. Again, this is pretty normal, like not so like just so different, but it's kind of normal. I find it interesting that we're told that Joseph's brothers hated him. It's very clear. And then we're told that they hated him even more, right? And so it's very clear. But after Joseph tells his brothers the second dream, you would expect it to say, and Joseph's brothers hated him even more. But that's not what it says, right? It's interesting. If you look at it, and if you look at verse 11, it says his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept this saying in mind. His brothers were jealous of him. And and you go on, and his brothers, they literally wanted to kill him. Now, this is where the family kind of becomes extraordinary, right? I mean, there's sibling rivalry. People get mad. Siblings get mad at one another. And people might even say, like, oh, I'm going to kill you. But nobody ever thinks that they're really going to do it. But Joseph's brothers, they don't just say it. They really were going to do it. And eventually, as we see, they sell him, to these Midianite traders. What makes them do it? What makes them do this to Joseph? Is it because they hate him? And I don't think so. I don't think they do this to Joseph because they hate him. I think there's something even more powerful than hatred. I think it's jealousy. I don't know about you, I find it very interesting that it ends with saying that his brothers were jealous of him, right? I wonder if jealousy is even worse than hating someone. And I wonder if it's the brothers' jealousy that makes them, go to this point. Again, a lot of you know the story well, and you know how the story goes, and it isn't surprising. And I think that's the shame of it, because when you read the story, like it should be really surprising. There should be parts of the story. This is God's special family. This is the family that God is going to use to bring the salvation of the world. This family. Again, some parts of it are normal. A dad that favors, one child over the others. Brothers that bicker and brothers that don't like each other. But then, if you keep on reading the story, they actually make this plan to kill their brother. Now, they don't kill him, but what they do instead is they strip him of his robe and they throw him in this pit. And I find it interesting. Verse 25, there's this interesting line. It says, then they sat down to eat. I don't know about you, but it kind of seems like an interesting line. Why is that important? But I think it just shows how bad these brothers are. They've just treated their brother in this way. You may not like him. Yeah. And it may hurt that he's your father's favorite. But you would think that, man, there might be some remorse. This is wrong. But they have no problem with what they've just done. They just tore this robe off of their brother and they threw him in a pit. And they're just sitting and they're just eating. Wow. I don't know. I think Joseph has probably been picked on his entire life. He's probably been the outsider because he's the favorite, right? And so I don't know how worried Joseph is when he's in the pit. But again, I read the story and, Judah, and we've talked about this before, but Judah comes up with this plan and he says, hey, let's sell him, and all his brothers agree. Before I get to that, there's another interesting part of the story. Remember, so Jacob sends Joseph to basically spy on his brothers. And so again, if I'm the brothers, I'm not happy because one, we're the ones out working, right? And Joseph is at home just with dad. And then Jacob sends Joseph out to basically spy on his brothers, and tell me if they're doing their job right or wrong. But it's interesting. He tells them, go to Shechem, and they're supposed to be there with the flock. And they're not there. But he meets this anonymous person, right? He meets this anonymous person. And this person tells him, oh, they're not here. They went to Dothan. And so he goes to Dothan. I just realized, if Joseph never met this anonymous person, none of this would have happened, right? It's kind of like if you've ever gotten in a car accident, you go through oh man, if I just didn't take a left there, or if I left 5 minutes later, this wouldn't have happened. But I find it very interesting that, he goes to Shechem, his brothers aren't there, and there's just this anonymous person. And if Joseph never met this anonymous person, he would have never gone to Dothan, and none of this would have happened, right? And I just think it's interesting that there's this anonymous person in this story. In any case, they come up with this plan. They're going to sell their brother. And again, I don't think Joseph's all that worried. They take him out of the pit, and then they're going to sell him to these traders. And now I think Joseph's starting to get worried. I think he's starting to realize, okay, this is next level harassment. I'm used to being played with, with my brothers, but this kind of seems like it's going next level, right? And he's like, right, okay, guys, we can stop. I'm sorry, right? Can you imagine this? I can. It's not just laughter anymore. I think he's really scared. It's all right, guys. Okay, come on. This has gone too far. Let's stop. And I don't know about you, but imagine how long do you think Joseph was crying out to his brothers for help? After his brothers had sold him into slavery, and he was being taken off by the Ishmaelite traders. I mean, if you were Joseph, how long would you cry out to your brothers for help? And nothing. You know what? I don't know if you thought about this, but this family is really messed up, right? I mean, if you think that you're messed up, or if you think that your family is messed up, if you compare your family with this family, it's got to make you feel pretty good, right? Honestly, it's got to be encouraging. because this is one really messed up family. And you know what surprises me the most? What surprises me the most is that God doesn't give up on them. You have to admit, again, you know the story really well, so sometimes you just don't realize how messed up this family is because you know what they do. But if you really kind of take a deep dive into this story, this family is incredibly messed up. And I think one of the most amazing things about this story is that God doesn't give up on this family, that God continues with them, and that ultimately God uses this family, right, to bring about the salvation of the world. I think it's a pretty incredible story. The first part, when you think about suffering in Joseph's life, it starts here. It starts in verse 25 of this chapter after his brothers sell him as a slave, right? This is kind of where the suffering starts. There's different kinds of suffering. One kind of suffering is it's a result of bad decisions, right? So you can suffer, you can experience suffering because you've made a bad decision, and the consequences of that bad decision is suffering, right? And in that sense, you're responsible, for the suffering that you're experiencing. Another kind of suffering is you didn't do anything wrong. Like it's something that's done unto you. And so, when you think about Joseph, you can say, well, his dad favored him, gave him this special robe, and then he bragged about these dreams. Not very smart. He deserved what was coming. Well, I think you're a little bit harsh. I don't think anybody really deserves this. What he did probably wasn't very wise, but I don't think he deserved to be sold and his entire life changed, right? To be sold to these Ishmaelite traders. So the suffering that Joseph experiences here, it's something that's done to him. It's not something that he's responsible for per se because of a bad decision that he made. We're going to skip over chapter 38. Chapter 38 is a great story. It's a story of Judah and Tamar. Christmas is coming up, right? And this is a great Christmas story. And if you thought that this family was messed up and they couldn't get any more messed up, then read the story of Judah and Tamar, and this story gets even more messed up, right? And it's just pretty amazing. But we're going to skip over chapter 38, and we're going to continue the story of Joseph in chapter 39. In chapter 39, it starts, and Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Yeah, the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A lot of people use Joseph as this example, saying, wow, look at how God used Joseph. Like, look at what Joseph had become. And as we'll look at the second half of the story next week, but we see that Joseph rises to this power of authority and position in Egypt. And a lot of people, they look at him as a role model, as an example, and they say, man, I want to be Joseph, right? I want to be Joseph. But it's important that you realize the reason that Joseph is because of what he went through during these 13 years. It's the suffering that he went through during ages 17 to 30 that prepared him to be in this position of power and authority in Egypt. Again, when you think about Joseph and his life and the suffering that he endures, not only is he sold and he's a servant in Potiphar's house, and again there, he experiences great success. And I don't know what you think. When you read the story, I don't know if you're like, wow, that's really cool. Some people I can see some people reading it that way. After this happens, Joseph, he's in Potiphar's house, the Lord is with him. There's some fantastic success here, right? And some people might be like, wow, that's awesome. It's awesome, how, he's able to do so well, in this circumstance. And maybe even after he's thrown into prison, yeah, that's bad. But wow, isn't it cool that, God gives him so much success? I wish I had that kind of success, right? It sounds really good. But if you really think about it, Joseph isn't where he wants to be, and Joseph isn't doing what he wants to do. I think a lot of you, especially if you're in that 17 to 30 age range, you can understand what Joseph is going through. I'll give you an example. After most of you graduate high school, you have this college that you want to go to. Maybe you have your top 3, 4, 5 colleges, right? And a lot of people, if they don't get into their top 1, 2, or 3 colleges, they get really sad, right? Because this isn't where I want to be. This isn't where I wanted to study. And so let's say you went to some small no-name community college, right? But let's say you did really, really well there. Would you be really excited? I mean, you could be, and it'd be a really good thing to be, but it's very possible that you might be like, this sucks, right? Because this isn't what I want. This isn't where I want to be. And so you could be experiencing a lot of blessing, and you could be experiencing all this success, but I don't know if you'd be like, this is so cool. This is great. Because this isn't what you wanted. This isn't where you wanted to be. And so as neat as it is that Joseph is experiencing all this success wherever he goes, this isn't what he wanted. If he could choose, I think if he could choose, he would give up all of this to go back home. I think he would give up all this in an instant just to go back home. And so again, he's a servant in Potiphar's house, and then he does everything right. And you've probably experienced this in your life, but man, you do everything right, and You suffer because of it, right? And I'm sure, what is Joseph thinking to himself? He's thinking like, why is this happening to me? Clearly, like, I did everything right? Not only did he not do anything wrong, but he did everything right, and yet he's been thrown into prison. We're told in verse 19 of chapter 39, after Potiphar's wife told him this, made up story, we're told that Pharaoh's anger was kindled. But I think it's interesting, we're not told who his anger was kindled toward. All right, so the question is, who is he mad at? Who is Potiphar angry at? Is he angry at Joseph because of what his wife told him? Or is he mad at his wife? It's really interesting. Think about Potiphar and his relationship with Joseph. Potiphar has entrusted everything in his house to Joseph. Now, again, we don't know exactly how long Joseph was serving Potiphar, but I don't think Potiphar just gave Joseph everything instantly. Agreed? It would take time. Like, you've got to build that credibility, right? You've got to build that trust. And so I'm sure it took a long time for Joseph to build that credibility and trust with Potiphar, to the point that we're told that Potiphar entrusts Joseph with everything. And then for a long period of time, right, Potiphar sees how Joseph acts while he has power. I've been told this. I don't know if you've been told the same thing. People change once they get power. People change once they get power. So even in churches, so I've served in churches, and a long time ago, when I was a youth pastor, I was talking to the senior pastor, and he says, Brendon, one of the most important things that you do as a pastor is that when you appoint leaders, you got to appoint leaders really well. But he says you have to be very careful, because before they're leaders, they're really humble, and they're hardworking. But once you give them leadership, once you give them power and authority, he said people change. People change. But then it's too late, because they already have that position of power and authority. And so when you look at Joseph, it would be possible, right, for Joseph to change as soon as Potiphar gave him all of this authority. But you know what? Potiphar, he sees that Joseph doesn't change. For years, Potiphar has known Joseph. He knows Joseph's character. He knows who Joseph is. And he knows that this story that his wife told him, it does not line up with who he knows Joseph to be, right? It doesn't. This just does not line up with the character of this man that you've entrusted everything. And then at the same time, I don't think Potiphar is clueless either. I think he knows his wife. And I think his wife is a little mischievous, right? Maybe his wife is manipulating. This is what I think, and I could be wrong, but I think that Potiphar is angry at his wife. But I think at the same time, Potiphar knows that he has no choice, but he has to punish Joseph. But if you look at the prison that Potiphar put Joseph in, this prison, you know where it's located? It's located in Potiphar's house. If you read the story, it goes on. Remember the royal cupbearer and the baker, they meet Joseph. This prison, it's in Potiphar's house. I don't think this is the big bad prison. I don't think this is the real prison. I think Potiphar wanted Joseph to stay close. I think Potiphar knew that he didn't do what he was accused of. But still, Joseph, he goes from this position in Potiphar's house, and again, goes to prison, shown great success. And we're not going to read on, but you can read on your own. There's some amazing things that happen to Joseph in prison, which eventually causes him to rise to this position of power and authority in Egypt, right? How is it that Joseph was able to suffer well? Like when you look at Joseph, clearly he endures lots of suffering. You could easily say 13 years of suffering, right? 13 years of going through hardship and difficulty and suffering. Like, how is it that he endures well. Well, there's only two times, there's only two things that we're really told about Joseph. So when Joseph goes to Potiphar's house, we're told that the Lord is with him, right? And then when he goes to prison, we're told the Lord is with him. And then what's really interesting is, when Potiphar's wife first says, lie with me, he says, no. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? I don't know about you, but I did not expect that. Because he just got done talking about his master, Potiphar, right? Hey, Potiphar, he's entrusted all these things to me. He is not greater than I. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against Potiphar? That's what I expect to hear. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against Potiphar? But he doesn't. He says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? It seems that during this time of suffering, that Joseph has developed an intimate relationship with God. And I use the word intimate because of this. Suffering has a unique way of pushing people to God. One of the questions that you can ask in small group, what words would you use when you think of the word suffering, right? What's one word? What are some words that you think of when you think of the word suffering, right? But one of the words that come to mind for me is suffering is powerful. Suffering is never neutral. Suffering never leaves you the same person that you would encounter that suffering with. Suffering is powerful. But suffering has a unique ability to push you to God. And when you look at Joseph, it seems, right, that Joseph, he knows God. Like, he has an intimate relationship with God. And I think one of the reasons that he has this close relationship with God is because that's one of the results of his suffering. So nobody wants to suffer. Nobody wants to suffering. Suffering is hard and suffering is powerful. But suffering, it has this unique way of pushing people to God. I entitled the sermon, The God of Joseph. A couple of weeks ago, if you're with us, we looked at the story of Leah, right? And we said that we worship the God of Leah, right? Leah was abandoned, rejected, not loved. But what this teaches us in the last half of Genesis is, again, what we learn about Joseph is we worship the God of Joseph. And one of the things that you see and you learn is that suffering is not wasted by God. And I don't think you find this just in today's passage, but I think you find this throughout the Bible. Suffering doesn't feel good, but suffering is never wasted by God. Never. There have been seasons in my life when I've gone through hard times and I've experienced suffering. And my mom, she's trying to make me feel better, right? And you know what mom says? Your parents probably said the same thing. Like, oh, God is preparing you for something great, right? And it's supposed to make me feel better. And like my answer is, I don't want God to prepare me for something great. I want the suffering to end. Like, I would rather not go through this. Like, honestly, if Joseph knew that he had to go through all of this to be exalted to this position of power, I bet Joseph would have said, God, no, thank you. You can choose somebody else. You can choose Ethan or Tristan. No, thank you. Like, I'd rather not go through it. Honestly, my mom, she'll be like, when I go through a hard time, she thinks she's making me feel better. It doesn't make me feel better at all. Like, oh, God is preparing you for something great. I'd rather not go through this. Thanksgiving is coming up. It's next week. Thanksgiving Sunday is next week. When you think of suffering, should we be thankful for suffering? Should we be thankful for our suffering? Or, I've asked this question, how can we suffer well? Another question is what can we be thankful for in suffering? Right? So should we be thankful for suffering? So I'm going to give you an example. When Joseph's brothers sell him to the Midianite traders, in that moment, do you think Joseph should be like, God, thank you that my brothers sold me? Right? Some of you are, no, there's no way. Agreed? There's no way that Joseph in that moment is saying, oh God, thank you that my brothers sold me to these Ishmaelite traders. That's like next level maturity that's like is non-existent. Now, when Joseph makes this awesome statement, what you intended for evil, God meant it for good. He was able to say that in hindsight. He wasn't able to say that while he was going through it. He was able to say that in hindsight. I think after you've gone through a season of suffering, I think it's possible to look back and you can actually say, God, thank you. But I don't know if you can say that when you're going through it. It's true. I think it's amazing. God doesn't waste suffering. But what can we be thankful for then while we're suffering? Or how can we suffer well? Just like God was with Joseph, God is with us. Right? God is with us in our suffering. And it's true that God doesn't waste suffering. God has a purpose. Right? Again, God doesn't waste suffering. I'm going to end by saying this. How do I know it's true? First of all, you realize every Sunday when we confess the Apostles' Creed, we confess that we believe in a God who suffers. In the Apostles' Creed, what do we confess? That Jesus, God the Son, he suffered. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. Jesus suffered, and God didn't waste that suffering, right? God uses suffering, and God uses it for his purpose. And again, God has a plan. And maybe the clearest and the best place that you see that in the Bible is in the death and the resurrection of Jesus. I hope that as we think about the story of Joseph, and again, we'll look at the second half of the story of Joseph next week. But again, remember that we believe in the God of Abraham. We believe in the God of Isaac. But we believe in the God of, Jacob. Again, one of the most amazing parts of this story is that God doesn't give up on the family of Jacob, right? But we believe in the God of Jacob. But again, we also believe in the God of Leah. And we believe in the God of Joseph, right? That God is with us in suffering. And that he's a God who doesn't waste suffering. He never wastes suffering. God redeems it, and God uses it for his purpose and plan. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for your word. Yeah, God, we thank you that in your word, that you reveal yourself to us. And we thank you that, God, that you are a God who is with your people, especially when we are going through hardship, difficulty, and suffering. Thank you, that God, that just as Joseph was not alone, that God, that we are not alone. Thank you, that God, that you are not only a God who does not waste suffering, but that you are a God who uses it, yeah, God, for your purpose and for your plan. God, help us to be comforted and strengthened, God, by this truth. So God, we thank you that you, who are the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, you who are the God of Leah and the God of Joseph, that God, that you are the same God, that God, that you are our God. We pray this in Jesus' name.
Thanks for watching. If you want to hear more good news, be sure to subscribe and join us next Sunday at 10 a.m. And if you live in the Atlanta area, we'd love to have you join us in person. Visit our website for more details. God bless you.